Fallout 4 has a weird issue with its protagonist. You see, Fallout has always been an RPG. In other words, the protagonist was what the character made of them. And Fallout 4 does not try and break this legacy. Kinda. Fallout 4 does lack a lot of the RPG elements found in earlier Fallout games. More importantly though, it also tries to introduce a very character-driven story with its main protagonist, which is at odds with an RPG-style protagonist, which by definition is granted their personality through the player. This disconnect between the jank era Fallout and the polished, heavy air quotes there, era of Fallout 4 is exemplified by the 3 games openings. Fallout 3 has a very long intro, but importantly, the first thing you see is Dr. Lee and your dad. This is very important as Fallout 3's main questline will see your dad as the main motivator of it. And Dr. Lee does not matter. I mean, not really, she is a fairly important secondary character, but realistically, she didn't need to be here. Once you're done naming yourself, the player is set on a journey of growing up, which produces many instances in which the player is introduced to both the mechanics of Fallout 3 and the mostly binary moral questions they will find themselves faced with. In New Vegas, the first thing the player will see is the face of Doc Mitchell, a kind-hearted soul that will help you but does not particularly care if you live or die. Something you see a lot in the Mojave Waste. Then after character creation, he sends you off into the desert with a pat on your back and little else. Both games have character creators, but it's never really focused on. They're kind of just quickly build your character, moving on. They're more interested in getting to the themes of the games and showing you what it will be like than focusing on what your character looks like, because that's not important to these stories because they're RPGs. You can care, but the game doesn't, because the game has no idea who your protagonist is. I mean, heck, in Fallout 3, you spend the majority of the tutorial not even looking like the character you built. On the other hand, Fallout 4 opens on Nate's face. Well, that's not like the others. The opening on Nate's face in Fallout 4 is really interesting. I understand that in-depth character customization was a big selling point for Fallout 4, but in doing so, the game kinda killed the most important part of character creation, the protagonist's characterization. You see, unlike the previous 2 entries, Fallout 4 is really the story of Nate, the sole survivor, which may seem in line with Fallout 3 and the story of the Lone Wanderer, and Fallout New Vegas being the story of the Courier. Heck, Fallout New Vegas literally has an entire DLC based around what the character did before the story. Problem: neither Fallout 3 nor New Vegas ever put substantial emphasis on the player being someone before. 3 puts you in a literal teenager and lets you play through some early memories. New Vegas goes for simple amnesia. There are hints of the Courier's past sprinkled throughout, but nothing ever takes away from the player's characterization of the Courier. But Nate? Nate has an entire background, a life in the military, and a literal child, none of which he forgets about or ever really seems to move on from. In fact, I think it's really weird that Nate can go from his wife being murdered to romancing several people in a few days without ever really mentioning it. This is really strange. The one game that allows you to actually romance companions is the game that gives you a partner murdered in front of your eyes, possibly within the same week as you beginning another romance. And as far as I can tell, that's almost never brought up. Nate is an actual character who loves his wife, but is also a blank slate in which the player can choose to romance any companion without repercussion or grief, which leads to a strange disconnect from the player and their protagonist. Nate should have a lot of trauma from seeing his wife murdered and waking up in a post-apocalyptic world, unlike the other 2 characters who have lived in that world since birth. But he doesn't seem to care, and the player doesn't care because the player is, if not used to this world, at least not shocked that that's what the world looks like. But Nate should be, and yet he's not. The main storyline also suffers from a similar issue. It simultaneously wants its character-driven story with Nate and Sean, but also wants its RPG storyline of the player choosing a faction due to their experience in the Commonwealth. You could argue that New Vegas does the same thing, but honestly not really. The courier hunting down Benny is really character-driven, yes, but has a lot of important differences. Firstly, there's a lot of options for how you deal with Benny, as I've stated before. There's really only one linear path for finding Sean. Secondly, wouldn't you want to know why you were shot in the head? Honestly, that questline is more of a mystery story than it is a personal quest for like vengeance or something. The quest is more about figuring out why you were shot than it was specifically hunting Benny down until he dies. This is why actually talking to Benny and even letting him go is a more than valid interaction the game presents to you. It's not really important why you're hunting him down. But Nate, and to further extent Nora, but Nora is a whole different thing that I don't have time to go into, only really react in one way. In fact, I actually find it really annoying. You're really forced into only a few different interactions upon meeting Sean. Thirdly, you don't actually need to do anything with Benny to finish the game. You can do the NCR questline without ever setting eyes on Benny ever again. So no, Fallout 4 does not do what New Vegas does. I do think it's trying to emulate it. Fallout 4 tries to do both New Vegas' questline and 3's questline at the same time without understanding what makes them work, nor what makes their protagonist work. The Courier is a bit of a famous character within the Fallout fandom, and gaming at large perhaps. And I think a lot of this comes from the mythology built up around the Courier by Lonesome Road. The Courier is characterized by the best Fallout DLC ever made, Fight Me, as an entity. It's not really about the Courier as a person who acts in a certain way, so much as it is about what the Courier means to Mojave and the people who live there. The Courier as an entity is most definitely far more popular and widely known than any other Fallout protagonist, and I think Bethesda was trying to emulate this with Nate. Instead of being an incredibly blank slate, they chose to introduce a protagonist to which we could more easily relate and become attached to, because let's be honest, no one is really attached to the Lone Wanderer. But while creating Nate, they failed to realize that this type of protagonist does not work with the game they were trying to make. I've been playing my way through the Assassin's Creed games recently, and they are very character driven. Shay, Ezio, and Arno are all well characterized protagonists one can become easily attached to. Well, some more than others. But none of them try to tell a story open to the player. The player takes control of the assassins and plays through their stories. Perhaps not always done in the way developers intended, but the stories are not open to the player like the Fallout stories are. As such, when you introduce a protagonist which is clearly supposed to be characterized independently from the player, but then make an entire game about the choices the player makes, it feels disjointed, strange, and unsatisfying. If you could just make choices not in character for Shay, that wouldn't make sense. But that's essentially what Fallout 4 tries to do. In many ways, the best compromises are when everyone is unhappy, because it means you have not sacrificed anyone's wants for that of another's. But when making entertainment, it just means your product is bland and unfocused, and no one is happy. Recently, it feels a lot of big studios have just been unwilling to really commit to anything, and I think that's what Fallout 4 suffers from. It can't commit to being New Vegas but on the East Coast, a Fallout 3 sequel, or its own game independent of both. And as such, it takes from all three ideas and compromises what would make those ideas good to the point where no one is happy. And all three ideas kind of just end up being the worst versions of themselves. If you will bear with me for just a little longer, I think the Nuka World DLC is a good example of the issues with Nate as a protagonist. Nuka World is a great DLC. It's one of my favorites, to be honest. Nuka World does what Fallout 4 does well. It doesn't even try to attempt an overarching story with powerful lessons and points. It may seem strange that I'm praising it for not even trying to have a greater point. End of sentence, it is strange. But it is also just fun gameplay and solid character writing, which are things that 4 excels at. It's really cool to finally see a rather mediocre game give up on trying to retroactively change its weaker components and instead doubling down on what it does really well and building a fun storyline around that instead. It also makes utterly no sense. Nuka World is about a group of raiders who enslave peaceful inhabitants to which the sole survivor, i.e. Nate the literal veteran, takes control of and helps them bring slavery back and get money. But it's important to know that he basically single-handedly reintroduces the slave trade back into an area where, I don't know, I guess the Minutemen wiped it out? I really don't understand why slavery is such a less common practice in the Commonwealth than the Capital Waste, California, or the Mojave. Anyways, yeah, we are to believe that a US Army veteran... Hi, side note, I'm making such a point about him being a veteran here, because due to all of the characterization we get for Nate, I think we are to believe he joined for altruistic purposes and not because he, hates Central American democracy. A loving father and all-round good guy who just vibes with psychotic killers and furries. This makes even less sense if you've actually played through the story, because the entire plot revolves around parental love and choosing the best option to run the Commonwealth. Even with options that the game clearly thinks to be immoral, aka the Institute, you can't really choose a faction because you are evil. In New Vegas, you can choose the Legion if you truly believe the stability they provide outweighs their authoritarianism, or just because you're evil and think slavery is neat. Both are acceptable and possible. In 4, every option you pick is taken to be done because the player thinks that that is the most morally good option. So it is weird then to have a protagonist who seems to be primarily driven by altruism to suddenly become a raider. And because Fallout 4 has no karma indicator, it means that the game can't even properly address this inconsistency by gauging whether or not this is in character for the player, let alone Nate. Nuka World knows what it wants to be. It's honestly one of, if not the best things Fallout 4 has to offer. Because it's not confused. It's not trying to be a sequel to Fallout 3, nor is it really trying to emulate New Vegas. It attempts to be its own thing by taking what's good about 4 and making it better, and it rocks. But because the rest of the game is hampered by its confusion about whether or not it's a Fallout 3 sequel, its own thing, or a successor to New Vegas, Nuka World does not really make any sense. While yeah, it does have a good guy path by killing all the raiders, it only really seems to affect interactions with the Minutemen and provides no rewards for taking it. Nuka World just makes no sense when given a previously characterized pre-world protagonist. In conclusion, Nate, or the sole survivor, is a perfect case example of what makes Fallout 4 strange and, in comparison to other entries, mediocre. Nate is split between an RPG protagonist and a characterized protagonist. And I don't know why they did this. People are going to be pissy if a Fallout game isn't an RPG. I know. But I think there's a place for non-open-ended or RPG Fallout games. And they had a perfect opportunity to do this. Fallout 76 takes place really shortly after the actual Fallout. Why not just have used Nate as a protagonist for a more linear and less decision-based plot taking place right after the bombs? Him being a pre-war man hardly if ever has an effect on the actual game because it's so far removed from his world. The idea of a pre-war man in Fallout does not even really make sense. Like, from a gameplay standpoint, either they will be so far removed from what they are familiar with that no knowledge or understanding of the pre-war world will really be fundamentally relevant, or they will have lived so long in the post-war world that they will have adapted. In the immediate aftermath of the bombs, it might be interesting to see a pre-war protagonist, but not well into the apocalypse. Fallout 3 and New Vegas make good use of their protagonists by knowing what they need. 3 needs a blank slate, and New Vegas needs a blank slate. But the Courier manages to form a mythology around himself through the themes of the game and its DLCs, because New Vegas has very definite ideas about its world. Fallout 3 keeps its protagonist from being characterized at all because it wants the player to be the only source of characterization. They want you to give the feeling of a teenager who hasn't really become anyone to go out into the waste and become someone. They want the person playing to become someone in the waste through their protagonist. Fallout 4 needs a blank slate, but wants a character, leading to Nate, one of the most characterized but least interesting Fallout protagonists. He might be interesting in a vacuum, but when put into Fallout 4 in the greater Fallout universe, he's just kind of so much less than the Courier and the Lone Wanderer, because fundamentally, he's trying to be 2 different characters that cannot exist in the same protagonist. All in all, Nate doesn't make sense for Fallout 4. This has been a really long script. I hope it made sense. Anyways, go touch grass.